Survival horror and Resident Evil seemingly kind of go hand in hand. And why wouldn't they? If I asked you to think of a survival horror franchise, 9 times out of 10, the first one that pops in your mind is Resident Evil. It's by far the most sold franchise of all time in the genre by a landslide. It's the most popular in the genre. And every year that there isn't any type of release in it, people are asking you what the world's going on. But despite all the success, what if I told you this genre of survival horror was slowly but surely dying? And it is none other than Resident Evil's fault. Seems crazy, right? But maybe it's more fact than fiction. What is up? Hopefully you guys are having a wonderful day. Back here with some more Resident Evil content for you. And today I got a very, very uncomfortable conversation to have. One that not many people are going to possibly like. It's going to ruffle a few feathers, but damn it, it's something we need to have. Because unfortunately I see things very, very differently and very bad. And with a certain game right on the doorstep being released, I'm very, very nervous, but let's see where we got here. So as I said in my opening statement, despite there being a lot of great survival horror games coming out in recent memory, the whole genre as a whole is absolutely been abysmal, and it's slowly but surely dying. Now you might be thinking, well, how can that be the case if you just said there's a lot of really good, great survival horror games? Well, if you give me a chance to explain my point, explain where I'm coming from, I think a lot of people might see things a lot differently by the end of this video. All I ask is that you give me a chance to try to explain stuff, and if you agree or disagree, that's all fine and dandy. But hopefully we can have a fruitful conversation about this. But let's get right back to what I'm thinking of. So, in my honest opinion, there's only 2 ways to do survival horror in today's gaming landscape. One would be the indie developed horror games, or indie horror titles as I like to call them. Basically your Crow Countries or your Tormented Souls, games like that. So that's one way you can do it. And the other way would be basically Resident Evil. And you'll find out that slowly but surely there is not hardly anything in between. If you're a indie developed studio, basically a low budget developed games, you basically can be successful because you don't cost a lot to make in the first place, and you don't need to make a lot to make back your cost of profits. Or if you're a bigger budget thing, you basically gotta be Resident Evil, because every other major big budget thing that has tried to sustain itself in the last 5-10 years has completely failed. And you might be thinking, well, what do you mean? What are we talking about? Well, you got to provide evidence or provide something for people to believe you. So I'm going to bring up 5 games that have been coming out the last 5-10 years, some more recent than others, as my list of examples of why it just seems like anything that's big budget and not Resident Evil, no matter how good it might be, fails. First off is Alan Wake 2. Now, this is a game I absolutely love, and I covered it a little bit last year, and I can't wait for the DLC to come out later this month. But once again, I'd be lying to you if I told you that this thing was absolutely successful. It got critically acclaimed, accolades, awards, but I tell you what, there was one thing it didn't get, and that was the sales. Now, when I mention a lot of the sales in this video, I'm going to go by estimates. I know not everything is the exact 100%, but, I'll pad out some things and try to get the best estimate I can based on what I know, but it still isn't going to change the things in the grand scheme of things. But nonetheless, I think right now, last time this thing was recorded, it was at 1.3 million sales units early this year, so we don't know exactly what it is now, but I'm going to do an estimate, and I'm going to say at this point right now, Alan Wake 2 is sold around roughly 2 million units. Okay, so keep that in mind, 2 million units. Also, basically meaning that it's still, I think only right now has it made back what it cost to make it in the first place, just about a year later. That's not very good. That's pretty abysmal for something as highly accoladed as this. But this was a sequel of a franchise. Maybe this is just a bad example. Let's go with a remake of a fan favorite game and Dead Space remake. Now, this was another game that got great reviews. People loved it. And it was bringing back a franchise that people love. I remember playing the original back when it released. The first two, wasn't a crazy fan of the third one, but nonetheless, it was something that people were talking about how good it looked, how it enhanced everything, and even added a few things. But unfortunately, as we heard earlier this year, EA's pulled the plug on doing any future Dead Space entries because it didn't sell enough, it didn't do well enough. And I believe the number at this time, maybe probably a little bit more, but as I said, I'll pad out the stats eventually, is roughly around, you guessed it, 2 million units from last time it was actually recorded. So, yeah, another 2 million unit thing. And once again, first one was a sequel in Alan Wake 2 of a franchise. This one is a remake, so we had a little different flavor there. But nonetheless, we're still at that 2 million thing and not being successful. And I'll also throw in another game in here, the Calisto Protocol, which came out about a month or so before Dead Space Remake. Now, Calisto Protocol wasn't as good and had a few problems. I still think it was a solid game, but just wasn't as good as we all thought it was. But it had a nice atmosphere, just had a few problems in terms of the gameplay and trying to mesh things together. But nonetheless, this was a brand new IP, and it also was a failure. And this one sold roughly around, you guessed it, that 2 million sales units, and it was also something that wasn't ultimately panned out to be very good. So there's a completely brand new title that, once again, as you guessed it, wasn't doing what sales were expected to do. We'll go a little ways back to a game I covered just recently on this channel and one of my personal favorites in Alien Isolation. And I was happy to go replay this game again since the success of the movie. But unfortunately, this was another one of those examples of something that I didn't want to give it too much credit. And by the way, I know this is kind of random, but I find it funny ever since I made the video talking about how IGN and their terrible review is ultimately what killed a lot of the success of this game. That literally a decade later, they just released an article on IGN talking about how some other person was writing in defense of this game. I just find it ironic, but back then, you guessed it, the game wasn't successful to continue, it in another sequel or franchise, and it sold, that same mark, a little bit over 2 million units, but damn well not successful it needed to be. So, still something that, what could have been, but another survival horror game, major title, just not selling what it needs to be. Seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it? But last but not least would be the release this year, Alone in the Dark. Now this one had even less success than everything else I've said before. So we're going to break that 2 million sale unit, because if this thing ever even sniffs that amount in its lifetime, I'd be amazed. But this thing had a few problems when it first launched. I didn't get it when it first came out, but I did get it later on. But so I got a little bit of a better value, as I think a lot of things were patched and fixed. But nonetheless, the damage had already been done. As I said, the studio that made this game ultimately shut down, so that's always a terrible sign to things to come. But this thing, and its opening, since it recorded numbers, was somewhere around like 20 to 40,000, somewhere in that mark, which is abysmal. So I'll be a little generous here. I'll say at this point in time, it's going to be anywhere from we'll say 100,000 units, which, as I said, is not very good. So I just did 5 games, all over the course of time. One, about a decade old, the other a few years old, and then one, last year, and then one this year. And all together, you had Dead Space Remake about 2 million units. You had Alan Wake 2 about 2 million units. You had Calisto Protocol about 2 million units. You had Alien Isolation about 2 million units, and this thing about 100,000 units. So I know some of those titles I mentioned have probably sold a lot more than 2 million units, or just guesses. So I'll pad out things a little bit, try to make it even, but it's still not going to change my grand point I'm going to make. So we'll say that all these games sales combined together is 8.5 million units. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, what's the point? Why do we add them all up here? What does that matter? What are you trying to make? Well, let's transition back to the Resident Evil franchise. And let's talk about an entry since the RE Engine days of Resident Evil that was been basically vilified a lot on the internet. A lot of people point out as this is the thing that was the bad one that was terrible. And that is none other than Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now when this came out, this got a lot of reviews saying like how bad it was in terms of comparing it to the original one. Now I still stand by what I say. I think it's a solid, good, entertaining game, just not a great remake. But nonetheless, the internet had spoken, and this was a thing that was absolutely terrible and lazy and rushed all to hell. So, how much did Resident Evil 3 Remake do? As of the last time the numbers were recorded, it's now over 9 million units. Let me say that again to you guys. Dead Space Remake, Alan Wake 2, Calisto Protocol, Alien Isolation, and Alone in the Dark all combined 8.5 million units. Resident Evil 3 Remake, the remake and the game in Resident Evil that got a lot of flack for it being the worst of all the remakes and the worst of all the more the recent Resident Evil games, sold 9 million units by itself, outselling all 5 of those games. Yeah. That's pretty bad. How bad is it? Well, hell, I'll let Jill tell it to you herself.
Bitch can't even swim.
If you didn't think that Resident Evil already had a huge monopoly on major survival horror developed games, then I don't see how you can deny it now. I mean, and a lot of those games I mentioned, not every single one, obviously like Alone in the Dark and Calisto Protocol weren't very great. But what was the excuse for Dead Space Remake, Alan Wake 2, or Alien Isolation? You know, 3, in my opinion, all-time great survival horror games, all doing different things. I mean, come on now, like why are they selling so terrible, but Resident Evil, even the worst of all of them, is supposedly just selling amazingly? Like, it doesn't make any logical sense. Well, that's what happens when one franchise is completely overshadowing and completely just devouring everything else, especially in the entirety of a genre. Nobody else wants to buy anything else other than Resident Evil. They'll talk about the other games, sure, but that's all they do. They'll talk about them, complain about them, write about them online, but they don't do the thing that matters most. And they wonder why there's so less and less of these things being made and why more people don't want to do other things. Which leads me to my next point, is the elephant in the room, which is right around the corner. Silent Hill 2 Remake. Now guys, I'm going to be dead serious with you. I am really, really nervous for this game. As we're right around the corner from it releases, I am really nervous for this game. Why? Because one, I want it to be really good, and I hope it is. But what happens if it's, let's just say for argument's sake, let's just say it is really good and it's a successful, you know, well-made game. But let's just say it didn't sell well. You know, the song and dance I just showed you recently with the other games. What if it doesn't sell well? Let's just say it gets all the reviews and accolades for a solid, well-put-together game, but nobody buys it. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. The survival horror franchise might as well just be renamed Resident Evil. Because at this point, unless you're an indie developed title, why in the world would any studio want to put in any type of major money and budget into doing anything other than Resident Evil? Because it's just basically be proven this fact that, damn, if even Silent Hill, the thing they used to compete with Resident Evil back in the day, ain't doing numbers, ain't doing things. And when I say numbers, guys, I'm not expecting it to do Resident Evil numbers right off the get-go, but successful numbers, like anything. Like all these things are just underselling. They're not making any type of profit. They're losing money. So it's not even a fact that about, oh, does it make as much? Can it make anything? That's the thing I'm asking. And so far, nothing has been able to do much of anything outside of just being Resident Evil. It's Resident Evil or bust, and I can't stand that mentality. But once again, you know, money talks, and when people aren't buying the things, like, why would you take a chance on anything else? I really hope, as I said, I'm really nervous, and I really hope that people can go out there and buy something only if the game is good. If it's not, I don't want it to sell a bunch if it's a terrible game. But barring if it is good, But if it doesn't sell and it's Silent Hill of all things, then what chance will we have of making anything else? So I'll conclude it with this, and this last part really hurts my soul to say, but I gotta be honest to you guys. And I think that's what you all will respect, whether if you 100% agree with me or not, but this is the part I gotta be honest with you. As I said, if Silent Hill 2 Remake is not a success, if it doesn't sell well, you know how much I love Dino Crisis. And if you don't know me, you know that I'm somebody that would do anything to get a new Dino Crisis entry for the first time in forever, whether it be a remake, remaster, or a brand new title, an actual sequel to Dino Crisis 2 or something like that. But why would they do it anyway? They shouldn't do it. They should never even remotely think about bringing it back, because why would they? It's a guaranteed loss of money. I mean, if Silent Hill 2 couldn't bring people to buy the thing, if, you know, Dead Space couldn't, if Alien Isolation couldn't, or Alan Wake 2 for that matter, what chance does damn Dino Crisis have? As much as I want to see it, you know, I can't look at the me aspect and ignore the whole aspect of not making any money. Because, damn, if those franchises couldn't, Dino Crisis ain't got a chance in hell, and might as well just remain extinct as the dinosaurs are. But, yeah, I'm really nervous right now, because I love the survival horror genre. I like covering the games. And I hate the fact that it's Resident Evil or bust for major developed horror games, because think of it like this. This isn't a win for Resident Evil either, because eventually, if Resident Evil is the only thing that really makes major developed horror titles, and that's all the ones they do, then eventually that well is going to dry up too. And they're going to become complacent. And there isn't someone there to challenge. I mean, I remember in those early 90s, 2000 days of horror, where horror was overall at its best. And the reason why was simple, because there was such a variety. There were so many survival horror franchises coming out, you know, being successful. Obviously, back then, games didn't cost nowhere an arm and a leg to make. But nowadays, the landscape is completely different. I remember, you know, having that Resident Evil and Silent Hill compete with each other, but you had so many other franchises there that could be successful. Obviously, as I said, you had your Dino Crisis and stuff like that. But you had so many things that could come out, be successful, make an impact. Nowadays, it's just like, if you have any type of big budget, why would any company, developer, want to invest any type of major money in any survival horror franchise that's not Resident Evil? They can't. That'd be idiotic at this point, because what in the hell makes them think that they can make a profit off it? And a lot of these games I mentioned, not all of them, a lot of them were, you know, some of the best we've had in the last 5 and 10 years. Excellent games, like Dead Space. I mean, I know some people might say, hey, well, what if it was a new Dead Space title? Yeah, it'd probably do the same exact thing if it was. Nobody's buying these things. Or if it's a sequel. And as I said, I brought in examples of, like, remake, sequel, new IP based, or game based on a famous IP. Or, you know, something's like a combination of a remake, remix, remaster, whatever you want to call it. But, like, I try to give different types of examples just to showcase, like, it doesn't seemingly matter. It's like nobody buys it if it's not called Resident Evil. They could literally drop the biggest pile of crap and just put Resident Evil on it, and it probably still make a profit more than all some of the other best horror titles we've seen. But as I always like to say, as my opinion, I want to hear your guys' opinion. How do you view the state of survival horror games right now? Do you think they're slowly getting worse and worse as time goes along, with no variety and seemingly any big budget horror game being Resident Evil or bust? Do you feel like this is going to hurt Resident Evil in the long run? And are you someone that's really interested to see how Silent Hill 2 Remake does within a week of it coming out? Let me know down in the comment section down below. But thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. And hopefully I see you guys back in the next one. Thanks, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.